Picture a man in his 50s sitting alone at a quiet restaurant. He isn't staring at his phone, hoping someone will call. He isn't uncomfortable with the empty chair across from him. He orders slowly, watches the room, finishes his meal, and leaves without needing anyone to validate the evening. Years ago, he might have filled that chair simply to avoid being alone. Now, he's more selective. Not because he dislikes people, but because somewhere along the way, he discovered something many men learn only after decades of relationships, workplaces, friendships, and family obligations. Some company costs more than solitude. Psychologists sometimes distinguish loneliness from solitude. Loneliness is the painful feeling that meaningful connection is missing. Solitude can be chosen, and when chosen freely, research suggests it can help reduce emotional intensity and create space for reflection. That distinction becomes especially important later in life. A peaceful man usually hasn't stopped valuing relationships. He may simply have become more sensitive to relationships that repeatedly disturb his internal equilibrium. And there are 7 kinds of people he tends to recognize faster with age. The first is surprisingly difficult to notice. The message arrives at 9:47 at night. Call me. No explanation. So he calls. There's a crisis, a conflict. Someone said something. Someone didn't respond. A minor disagreement has somehow become an emotional fire requiring immediate attention. He listens, calms things down, offers perspective. 3 days later, another fire. Then another. Eventually, he notices the pattern. The emergencies change, but the emotional atmosphere never does. Psychology gives us an important clue here. Emotions don't remain neatly contained inside individuals. Research on emotional contagion has shown that moods and emotional states can spread through social interaction, often without people consciously realizing it. Spend enough time around chronic agitation, and your nervous system begins participating in someone else's instability. This is why peaceful men often become cautious around people who constantly manufacture urgency. They aren't avoiding emotion. They're avoiding emotional conscription, the expectation that another person's internal chaos must immediately become their responsibility. And there's a profound difference. A mature relationship can contain difficult conversations, grief, frustration, even conflict. Peace isn't the absence of uncomfortable emotion. It's the absence of unnecessary disorder. By midlife, many men understand the hidden price of constantly being pulled into someone else's storms. Attention fragments, patience shrinks, and even quiet moments begin to feel like the interval before the next crisis. So the peaceful man does something his younger self may have considered selfish. He stops answering every alarm, not because he no longer cares, because he's finally learned that caring about someone doesn't require living inside their weather. And the second person he avoids is even more complicated, because this person may never raise their voice at all. The message arrives at 9:47 at night. Call me. No explanation. So he calls. There's a crisis, a conflict. Someone said something. Someone didn't respond. A minor disagreement has somehow become an emotional fire requiring immediate attention. He listens, calms things down, offers perspective. 3 days later, another fire. Then another. Eventually, he notices the pattern. The emergencies change, but the emotional atmosphere never does. Psychology gives us an important clue here. Emotions don't remain neatly contained inside individuals. Research on emotional contagion has shown that moods and emotional states can spread through social interaction, often without people consciously realizing it. Spend enough time around chronic agitation, and your nervous system begins participating in someone else's instability. This is why peaceful men often become cautious around people who constantly manufacture urgency. They aren't avoiding emotion. They're avoiding emotional conscription, the expectation that another person's internal chaos must immediately become their responsibility. And there's a profound difference. A mature relationship can contain difficult conversations, grief, frustration, even conflict. Peace isn't the absence of uncomfortable emotion. It's the absence of unnecessary disorder. By midlife, many men understand the hidden price of constantly being pulled into someone else's storms. Attention fragments, patience shrinks, and even quiet moments begin to feel like the interval before the next crisis. So the peaceful man does something his younger self may have considered selfish. He stops answering every alarm. Not because he no longer cares, because he's finally learned that caring about someone doesn't require living inside their weather. And the second person he avoids is even more complicated, because this person may never raise their voice at all. At first, it barely registers. He mentions a promotion. The other man immediately talks about earning more. He shares that his relationship is finally going well. The conversation somehow shifts towards someone else's happier marriage. He buys something he has wanted for years, and instead of curiosity, he hears why another model would have been better. Nothing openly hostile happens. That's what makes this person difficult to recognize. The relationship still looks like friendship from the outside. There are dinners, jokes, familiar stories, but underneath them runs an invisible scoreboard. Social comparison is a normal part of human psychology. Leon Festinger's classic social comparison theory proposed that people often evaluate themselves by comparing their abilities and opinions with those of others. But comparison becomes corrosive when another person's progress repeatedly feels like evidence of your own inadequacy. Then conversation stops being connection. It becomes measurement. A peaceful man eventually notices how strange this relationship makes him feel. He begins minimizing good news. He edits stories before telling them. He may even feel guilty about succeeding because he already knows the subtle response waiting on the other side. And that reaction tells him something important. Healthy relationships don't require you to become smaller so someone else can remain comfortable. This doesn't mean real friends must celebrate everything uncritically. Mature friendship includes disagreement, honesty, and occasionally uncomfortable truth. But honest disagreement feels different from concealed competition. One helps you see yourself more clearly. The other makes every achievement feel like entering a contest you never agreed to join. After 40, time begins to feel less theoretical. A man becomes increasingly aware that attention is finite, energy is finite, and relationships consume both. So he may quietly stop participating. No confrontation. No dramatic ending. He simply shares less, visits less, and protects the parts of his life that don't need an audience. Because sometimes peace isn't created by winning the competition. It's created by realizing there never needed to be one. And the third person peaceful men avoid can be harder to leave, because instead of competing with your success, they slowly make you responsible for their happiness. It begins with small adjustments. He cancels dinner with friends because someone is upset. He changes how he says things to prevent another reaction. Before making an ordinary decision, he mentally rehearses how the other person might respond. Eventually, he isn't simply considering someone's feelings. He's organizing his life around managing them. This pattern can appear anywhere, in marriage, friendship, family, even at work, and it often hides behind a virtue, empathy. Empathy tells us to recognize another person's emotional experience, but emotional responsibility has boundaries. In healthy adult relationships, each person can offer support without assuming complete responsibility for regulating the other's inner world. Psychologists studying family systems have long examined the importance of differentiation, the ability to remain emotionally connected to others while maintaining a stable sense of self. Without that separation, closeness can slowly become emotional fusion. One person's disappointment becomes the other's emergency. One person's anxiety determines everyone's behavior. And peace becomes dependent on keeping someone else permanently satisfied. A peaceful man eventually notices what this does to him. He starts scanning faces before speaking. He explains harmless decisions excessively. He feels relief when certain people leave the room, not because he hates them, but because his nervous system can finally stop monitoring them. That relief is information. It doesn't automatically mean the relationship is unhealthy. Every meaningful relationship sometimes requires accommodation, patience, and sacrifice. The deeper question is whether accommodation moves both ways. Can he say no without punishment? Can he disagree without being made responsible for someone's distress? Can two adults experience different emotions without treating the difference as betrayal? With age, peaceful men often become less willing to confuse love with emotional management. They can care deeply and still allow another adult to be disappointed. They can listen without immediately fixing. They can remain compassionate without surrendering their internal stability. Because emotional maturity isn't becoming indifferent to other people's feelings. It's learning where their feelings end, and your responsibility begins. But the fourth person creates a different kind of exhaustion. They don't demand that you carry their emotions. They make you question your own. The conversation ends, but something follows him out of the room. Confusion. He remembers what was said. He remembers the promise, the insult, the agreement. Yet somehow, by the end of the discussion, he's defending his memory instead of discussing what actually happened. You misunderstood. I never said that. You're making too much of it. One incident proves very little. Memory is imperfect, and honest people remember the same event differently. The pattern is what matters. When someone repeatedly denies events, rewrites conversations, or dismisses another person's perceptions to escape accountability, the relationship can become psychologically disorienting. The term gaslighting comes from the 1938 play Gaslight and is often used too casually today. Clinically and psychologically, the more serious idea involves persistent manipulation that causes someone to question their own judgment or perception of reality. For a peaceful man, this becomes exhausting because every disagreement develops a second layer. First, there is the problem itself. Then there is the battle over whether the problem even happened. Eventually, he may begin collecting evidence for ordinary conversations, remembering exact words, saving messages, mentally preparing a case. And that's when something important has changed. A relationship has begun to resemble a courtroom. Peaceful men often withdraw from this dynamic without trying to win the final argument. They've learned that endless explanation rarely creates honesty where accountability is consistently avoided. But there are three more people they quietly distance themselves from. The chronic critic who disguises contempt as just being honest. The taker who remembers you mainly when something is needed. And perhaps the most deceptive of all, the person who seems perfectly pleasant in public, but repeatedly violates boundaries in private. Different personalities. Same underlying cost. They force a man to spend his limited emotional energy defending his dignity, attention, or sense of reality. By midlife, that energy has become valuable. So he becomes more selective, not colder, not antisocial, but more precise about what closeness should feel like. Because the older he gets, the less interested he becomes in relationships he must constantly recover from. There comes a point when a man stops measuring his life by how many people are in it. He begins measuring it by what happens inside him when they are around. Does he feel respected? Can he speak without rehearsing every sentence? Can silence exist without tension? Can disagreement happen without punishment? That is the deeper lesson behind these 7 people. the chronic crisis maker, the quiet competitor, the person who makes him responsible for their emotions, the one who distorts reality, the chronic critic, the taker, the boundary violator. Avoiding these patterns isn't about labeling people as good or bad. Human behavior is more complicated than that. It's about recognizing what repeated exposure does to a life. After 40, peace often stops looking like isolation and starts looking like discernment, the ability to remain open to people without giving everyone equal access to your inner world. Because a peaceful man hasn't necessarily built higher walls. He's simply become more careful about where he puts the doors. If this gave you a different way to think about peace, relationships, and the people we keep close, subscribe. There are deeper conversations ahead.